So Taeku Lee is professor of political science and law at the University of California, Berkeley. He is also associate director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, managing director of Asian American Decisions and co-principal investigator of the National Asian American Survey. His books include Mobilizing Public Opinion, Transforming Politics, Transforming America, Why Americans Don't Join the Party, Accountability Through Public Opinion, Asian American Political Participation, Oxford Handbook of Racial and Ethnic Politics. Taeku Lee was Transforming America in 2006. That's what I have in my notes, but I can see that's not right. Do you want to give us the... He's still transforming America.
It's a good project.
And so I think that's a good place for me to stop right there. And please enjoy this panel. Welcome to all of you.
Excuse me, do you have any water?
Yes.
Any water?
Yes. Okay.
Thank you so much, and
Hi.
good afternoon, everybody.
Nice to meet you.
I realize it's been an incredibly rich and uplifting day, but I also realize we're at the 4:30 hour. That's usually when I need a nap. And even though the Bay Area has, I think some of the world's, best, single source, slow drip, cold pressed coffee, at around 4:30 in the afternoon, the effects of caffeine wear off. So what I have instead of more coffee for you is an incredibly exciting panel who will share their expertise and their thoughts with you on the art and science of building power, and especially building power at the particular moment that we are in. So let me introduce this panel to you. So first we have Ravi, who is a nationally recognized scholar and activist who is an expert on black politics, minority representation, urban politics, and LGBTQ candidates of color. He is a professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth University, and his books include 21st Century Urban Race Politics, Black Mayors, White Majorities, and the Little Rock Crisis, What Desegregation Politics Says About Us. He's currently at work on a book titled Black Queer Electoral Politics. Dr. Perry has played a leadership role in local chapters of the ACLU in Mississippi and the NAACP in Massachusetts, as well as leadership roles in the National Conference of Black Political Scientists and the National Association for Ethnic Studies. We also have on our panel Lisa Garcia-Bedolla, who is my colleague at Berkeley, I'm very proud to say, a chancellor's professor in the School of Education. Lisa is, I'm going to embarrass you a little bit now, one of the most prolific scholars that I know of in political science, and she's the only two-time winner of one of the main book awards that the American Political Science Association gives, the Ralph Bunche Award. Yes. First for her book, Fluid Borders, Latino Power, Identity, and Politics in Los Angeles. And then a second time for Mobilizing Inclusion, Transforming the Electorate Through Get Out the Vote campaigns. Lisa was previously our chair of Berkeley's Center for Latino Policy Research, and she's currently co-founder of the American Majority Project Research Institute, which is a very exciting new think tank which takes a data-driven approach to understanding the political and policy implications of diversity and the new American majority. Or as Donald Trump might tell you by showing you an electoral map of 2016, the old American majority. Finally, it's a personal honor to introduce Marshall Ganz. Overachieving, overweening parents like myself these days talk about the value of having your college-age kids take a gap year in order to enrich your education with real-life experience, like Malia Obama. Well, Marshall took 28 gap years between his junior and senior years at Harvard College. Yes. And along the way, he volunteered for the Mississippi Summer Project in 1969, then helped to organize with SNCC. Yes. then helped to organize farm workers in California with Cesar Chavez before becoming director of organizing for the United Farm Workers. And then, having learned a thing or two from the real world, Marshall returned to Harvard, where he finished his bachelor's, master's, and PhD, and has remained on faculty at the Harvard Kennedy School since the 1990s. And along the way, Marshall helped to develop an agency-based framework for organizing and building movements, which has heavily influenced Camp Obama and then Organizing for America's approach to mobilizing. So for the next hour, our trio of experts will share their thoughts on how to build a movement and work towards social justice at what is unquestionably a moment of setback, uncertainty, and anxious threat to our democracy, to our collective prosperity, to our planet's health, threat to safety and security and life and livelihood to friends, family, and loved ones. So we all know that threat and anxiety can be paralyzing and demobilizing. But I think especially in this room, we also know that threat and anxiety can be an opportunity to redouble our efforts, to rethink our frameworks, and to rebuild our movements. And that's the case today, just as it has always been in the past. And thinking about this panel, I was thinking about a keynote address that I gave last Friday at UCLA, which was holding a conference on the 25th anniversary of the LA uprisings. And I think it's instructive to take a look back to 25 years ago. 1992 was also a moment of great uncertainty, seeming setback, and great anxiety, not just in terms of the justice that was deferred on April 29th, but also in terms of the kind of fixed categories, mental categories that we carry in our head about things like what criminal justice means, what the police means, what justified violence means, what civil disobedience means, and so on. 1992 was also the time when Pete Wilson, the Pete Wilson, for those of you who are young out there, Pedro Wilson, had just defeated Dianne Feinstein to become governor of California. And California at that time, it's important to remember, was facing the greatest economic challenge to its state that it had faced since the Great Depression. And guess who Wilson targeted and scapegoated for political gain in his campaign? It was immigrants from Mexico, especially unauthorized immigrants, and Wilson really played up the politics of fear and racial division and successfully spearheaded the passage of Proposition 187, which, again, for those of you who may not have been around back then, was legislation that required the state to screen everybody in the state for citizenship, and with that, access to a lot of benefits of belonging. That should sound familiar, right? And a key point to going back 25 years in time is that out of the ashes of South Central LA and Koreatown, and as a postscript to Proposition 187, there was a real redoubled effort in this state to organize and to mobilize. So the LA Uprising is what led to the formation of efforts like the Black Korean Alliance, Rebuild LA, and in the community that I inhabit, organizations like the Korean Youth and Community Center, and the Korean Immigrant Workers Alliance, which is a multiracial alliance on the behalf of immigrant workers. And scholars have shown that the effect of Proposition 187 in the long term was to mobilize and organize Latino Californians to naturalize as citizens, to register as voters, and then to vote Democratic. In 1992, the state of California was very much in play in terms of partisanship. So in the 1992 presidential election, 46%, this may come as an unfamiliar fact to a lot of you who don't remember California back then. In 1992 presidential election, 46% of Californians voted Democratic. The rest did not vote Democratic. And Latino Americans were only 9% of the electorate in that state, and about 65% of them voted Democratic. Fast forward to the present, more than 60% of California votes Democratic. Latino Americans are 1 out of every 4 voters in this state, and almost 80% of Latino Americans vote Democratic. that was the effect of the organizing and the mobilizing in response to Proposition 187. And oh, by the way, legal activists also deployed all sorts of challenges in the courts to make sure that Proposition 187 never saw the light of day. And that should also sound familiar to us. So Wilson may have won the moment, but I would argue he did not win the movement. And you could also argue that, 4 of LAPD's finest may have won the moment in terms of avoiding jail time for, their racist thuggery. But the LAPD department is today no longer a department that will have a police chief like William Parker or Daryl Gates. Whether in principle or in practice, they are now much more committed to community policing and the principles of relation-based criminal justice than they were back then. And I think that's an important gain. And with that selective view into the past, it's selective because I know not everyone's going to agree about that narrative there. Let me just jump into some questions for the present. So first, to the panel, how do you understand the implications of both the 2008 and 2016 election for the work of democracy and social justice today? So what is the story of now that we learned from these 2 historic elections? And what are the important cautions and setbacks? And what are the key successes to build on? So let me start there. I've got some follow-ups, but let me start there and open up for the panelists. Either way, Ravi, do you want to start us off?
Sure. First, I'm honored to be here. This gathering is exactly the types of gatherings that need to happen after a disaster on November 8th. And so I'm really honored to be here to have this discussion with all of you, because I do think it's a community discussion that we need to have. Well, 2008, essentially, we did a very good job. We came out, we understood the issues, we understood what was at stake vis-a-vis Bush for 8 years, et cetera. And we, despite dealing with a compromised American political system that we may not have all agreed with, wrapped around, most of us did, Senator Obama from Illinois, and he became president of the United States. African American voters, my area of expertise, voted in higher numbers in 2008 than they had prior, and then in 2012 beat that record as well, and even outpaced whites in terms of their participation in an American presidential election. And so we did well in 2008. What that demonstrates is that when you have a coalition of young people and a coalition of people of color, and a coalition of white moderates, you can actually achieve measurable success for the marginalized communities. And I will say that now, because I know a lot of us have different opinions on Obama's record vis-a-vis marginalized communities, but if you look at his record vis-a-vis any other president before him, and you control for the times and the issues of the day, there literally is no other better president for marginalized communities in the modern era than President Barack Hussein Obama. That's a fact. And so we acknowledged that in 2008, 2012 as well, and then 2016 comes along, and somehow we, I think, missed our footing. I'll put it kind of politely. We were focused on so many other things. And to be fair, there was a lot that happened between 2008 and 2016. Instagram became more popular. Twitter became more popular. Our attention, seriously, to technological waves and what that does to our inattention to issues that are occurring right in front of our face in our communities, that actually was more pervasive in 2016 than it was 8 years prior or 4 years prior. And that turned our attention away, particularly for young people who were, I think, in many ways, and I do say this pejoratively, hopefully we can get into friendly arguments, who were duped by progressives and rhetoric that indicated that so many things could fall out of the sky happily with a right-wing Congress if only you elect Bernie Sanders. And of course, we know that that rhetoric, A, was not exactly accurate, and B, even had he been elected, would not have been likely possible. And so you wrapped around millions of people around issues in 2016 presidential election that really did not have the likelihood of actually being successfully achieved. And so we were duped in that effort. And then lo and behold, amongst 16, 17 Republican candidates, this man from New York wins. And in the last week, and I'll pivot to this and allow my colleagues to join here, in the last week, he was endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan. And despite whatever people's opinions were in the Democratic primary, whatever people's opinions were vis-a-vis the argument that Trump was the same as Clinton or what have you, if you're a person of color or you're something other than those in power in the United States of America, that should have been the wake-up call to change your position and to vote for the one individual who would have made the KKK candidate unlikely to win. Many of us in this room did not do that, and I'd like to talk the rest of the time about why that's a failure that we need to make sure we never make it happen again.
Okay. Oh, okay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, like Taeku says, that sleep. I want to be sure everybody's awake.
It's dark out there.
Yeah. No, yeah, because we can't see. It's really weird. Very strange. I guess my take is that whenever we would do campaigns, we would have three elements. We'd have a story, a compelling narrative, a strategy of how to translate resources we had into the power we need to get what we wanted to win, and a structure, a way to organize and engage people in it. The Obama campaign, 2008, 7, 8 in particular, had all three elements. There was a narrative, and it was a narrative in response to Bush, in response to the market crash. It was a narrative that wasn't simply of anger, but also of hope. And I think you need both in order to really inspire engagement. There was a strategy that emerged from the campaign that made sense. And there was a structure. In particular, that campaign invested in building organization in a way that no campaign had for years, translating the motivation that people had into actual organization, state by state by state, which created a kind of civic capital that hadn't been built for years and, continued to pay benefits, I think. Now, that was a very successful effort. My own view is that the 2 years that followed were not as successful. In particular, we confronted governance by trying to minimize opposition as opposed to governance by trying to maximize support. As a result, the organization that had been built was put on ice. And the capacity to mobilize that was at a peak level, really. In particular, the opportunity to redefine our understanding of government and the economy just didn't happen. Right. Instead, we got Larry Summers. Right. Now, that created a problem. Much of the country was preoccupied with economic problem. And certainly healthcare reform was important, but that wasn't what was on everybody's mind. And the mortgages and the need to engage in people's lived experience and exercise political leadership for that just didn't happen. Instead, the Tea Party happened. Tea Party happened. And that was tough to recover from because the next 6 years were damn tough. Very, very tough. So along comes 2016, and a bunch of chickens come home to roost. Yeah. 2016, we didn't really have a story. We didn't have a narrative. Bernie kind of had a narrative. Bernie was pretty compelling. Donald Trump, he had a narrative. He had a set of values that translated into very clear policy objectives, which were a wall and a ban and trade. Now, Bernie had free college, universal health care. But of course, the candidate that won the Democratic nomination didn't really have that. There was no story there. The strategy was very unclear. And there was no organizational capacity that was built. I couldn't believe the fascination with technology that you could model who was going to vote for your candidate and turn them out without ever having asked that person, were you going to vote for our candidate? And this sort of enchantment with the technology, instead of the empowerment of the people, was one of the big problems.
Yep.
And so, you know, we wound up then, and of course the quirks of our electoral system cannot be ignored. Those are really serious, like the Electoral College. But so then we wind up with what we wound up with. You know, Trump was organizing, I believe, out of fear and anger. It's very different. When you organize out of fear and anger, you mobilize people to depend on you. You're the savior. You rob people of their agency, and you turn them against everybody else because you're going to save our group. What Obama did in 2007-8 was mobilize out of hope, which enhances people's agency. It's yes, we can, not yes, I can. And together we engage with the problems that we have to face. Well, we didn't have that counter narrative in any effective way in 2016. And so Trump carried the day. I think that, and we'll probably get to this more later, but I think that the reaction for me has been genuinely inspiring. Whether it's Indivisible, whether it's the Women's March, whether it's the demonstrations today, or whoever thought there'd be a march for science? Jesus, this is kind of amazing. No, the way
Whoever thought we would need one.
Well, the way so much of the American public has responded, actually, I think, creates this as an opportunity. But we can talk more about that later.
Yeah.
So thank you also for having me, and to Taeku for such a kind introduction. Building on what's been said, I think fundamentally what 2008 taught us, what Professor Ganz just said, is that if you inspire and organize people, they actually will turn out. And what 2016 taught us is that if you don't, they won't. And that's the lesson. I was asked to focus on success since academics tend to be negative. So we're going to talk about what went well in 2016, which I think does show that that's true. So we had big successes in Nevada. Nobody believed that Cortez Masto would have been the first Latino U.S. Senator, 6 months before the election. So that was a big deal. In Arizona, out of SB 1070 has come an incredible amount of energy and organizing, particularly in the Phoenix area. So right now in Arizona, the quintessential red state, you have 24 of 90 state legislatures who are Latino. You've got a pro-immigrant majority on the city council of the city of Phoenix. You had 3 Latinos elected to that city council. They passed the largest minimum wage increase in the country, plus paid sick, which of course they're now trying to get rid of, but they passed it. They passed a $32 billion transit bond, and you got rid of Joe Arpaio. Not a small thing.
That's a good thing.
Right? That's a good thing. Here in California, we had Prop 55 pass easily, which again, second time in the last 50 years that California voters have voted to tax ourselves. That's a big change. The first was Prop 30, which was what we were extending with 55. The Million Voter Project, which most of you I'm sure have heard of, but that's a coalition of California Calls, PICO, Mobilizing the Immigrant Vote, and other great organizations. They talked to 650,000 California voters and ID'd 550,000 of those as supporters of Prop 55. And so that organizing, that infrastructure is what made that success possible. So again, even in the 16 context, we have lots of examples of why organizing works. What went wrong? I mean, I think fundamentally building on, I was saying earlier backstage to Professor Ganz, I'm basically going to stand here and say he's right and his model works. And the problem is we don't implement it. And so if you think about the Clinton campaign, a core problem, that fascination with technology, the idea that decontextualized data that is not informed by people working on the ground can actually give you meaningful information about politics, 2016 should tell us that that will never work. And fundamentally, they focused on white swing voters. They did not focus on voters of color. They assumed that anger and horror towards Trump would mobilize people. What we learned in 1994 here in California is that anger does mobilize some people under certain circumstances. It also demobilizes people. And unless you talk to them and give them something to vote for, they are not going to turn out to vote. So one of the key questions I think to just think about is what are the assumptions that we're making about what we need in terms to turn out voters of color. And the question is, where do you locate the problem, right? Do we think that non-voter turnout is an individual level pathology, just somebody not caring? Or do we think that it's really a product of structures, thinking about voter suppression, thinking about how we socialize people into politics, thinking about the lived environment for many folks of color and why they may grow up very logically thinking that politics is not a place where they can have and make meaningful change in their lives? And the problem is, at least right now, I think on the Democratic side, is that we're still in the individual pathology frame rather than thinking about that structural change.
That's right. Thank you. So, as Lisa pointed out, this is a panel of scholar organizers and scholar activists, but sometimes the scholar part can really drag us down in the sense that
I was positive.
we're deeply socialized to.
If we can win in Arizona, we can win anywhere, people.
Well, hang on a second.
Getting rid of Arpaio, that's...
It's huge. Although then
these
he's
are all
like
big,
a
but
zombie
so-
sheriff. He
so-
turns up in Washington, but still.
Here's the thing, though. We were 80,000 votes in 3 states,
Yep.
plus foreign intervention and, a rogue FBI director, away from maybe having a panel like this and talking about a different kind of way of thinking about what succeeded and what failed in 2016. So keeping that in mind, I want to pivot a little bit to the next question, which builds on the fact that we're in this kind of moment where political scientists like me are turning to what other political scientists have been focusing on when they've studied the rest of the world. So questions like, what makes a society authoritarian? What makes it more democratic? And I stumbled into this thing that I read back when I was in graduate school, which is a definition that one political scientist, Adam Przeworski, gives to when you know that a society is essentially a mature democracy. And what Przeworski says is that happens when, in his words, democracy is the only game in town, when no one can imagine acting outside of democratic institutions, and when all that the losers want to do is to try again within the same institutions under which they have just lost. And so this is the win next time or change the game question. So is this a time when what we should be doing as a progressive left is to try to win the next moment, or is this a time when we need to really radically break from the past and think about building a new movement? And just to anticipate, again, because the scholar piece can drag us down, and I know one of you will try to say that's a false opposition. If it's a false opposition, then tell us, why that's the case.
Yes, it's a false opposition. It's a false opposition because it presumes that we can't do both. I happen to believe in the Hamilton strategy of a dual strategy. I think that we can and should be in the street corner as loud as we can, and all the metaphors that inspires and engenders. But we also have to engage in the institution of politics, as Doug McAdams said this morning. If we are not engaging in the institutions of politics where power is located in the United States of America, then you've already set yourself up to lose. And the issue that I have with a lot of progressives, and I will limit my conversation to black progressives since that's the community I'm most familiar with, is that it's this idea that if we somehow can embrace the theory of not wanting to engage with the current structure of politics, being anti the Democratic Party, being anti-capitalism, being anti the two-party system in general, some people even being anti the Electoral College. Like, these are all waves within the progressive community, and we actually have to have a real conversation about the consequences of that. As a result of these waves and arguments from, and I'll name some names, arguments from people like Cornel West and Eddie Glaude and others on major social media networks and on national, international television all throughout last fall, that literally told people to either not vote or to vote for someone who had no likelihood of winning. And to say that did not have an impact on those 75,000 people who did not turn out in Milwaukee and Philly and Detroit, and most of those people were people of color, and most of those people of color were black, and for us to not have a real conversation about that, I think is a real egregious error. and we will find ourselves in 2020 having the same problems and having a discussion about why in the hell did Trump get reelected. If we don't solve that problem, to me it's not even funny anymore. It used to be funny. It's not funny anymore. We made a mistake by allowing ourselves to believe in something that I actually do believe in. I actually love the black progressive argument. Theory is my second field of study after American politics, at least what I did in grad school. And I love it, but theory is not the real world. The real world is we have people who are actually need problems solved today, not 5 years from now, not when the system changes, whenever, not when the party becomes something new. And so I was having an argument with this, with one of these leading black progressives literally a few hours ago on Facebook, and his argument was this. His argument was, we don't need a seat at the table, we need to create a new table. And my response is, folks don't have time to wait for that table to be built. It's very simple. You don't have time when you were struggling to make ends meet, when your son just died from suburban Dallas police officers illegitimately at 15 years old leaving a house party today. You don't have time to wait 5, 10 years for the party to reinvent itself, for politics to change, for the electoral college and somehow to miraculously become something different than what it is. That's not the real world. You have to deal with the real world and what it is right now. And the reality is, whether we like it or not, and this is a problem with political scientists and the whole captured group argument for African Americans, but it's a fact. In the modern era, the real only locus of opportunity for African Americans today to solve short-term problems is the Democratic Party, whether we like it or not. And so we have to fight within it, not fight external to it.
Go.
I get to go? So I have one slide. I was going to bore you with a little bit of data. Can we have it? There we go. Okay, so what this shows is midterm election turnout among eligible voters from 1978 to 2014. The red line is whites, the orange line is African Americans, the blue line and then the green line hidden behind it are Asian Americans and Latinos. I want this to soak in for a moment. What should strike you, first of all, is there's a heck of a lot of white at the top of that slide, right? And we have a structural problem in American politics, right? Our turnout in midterm elections is abysmally low, even among white people. Even among the people in power, they don't turn out to elect their leaders. If we look at what happened in 2014, the other thing that should strike you is that it's fairly flat. This isn't a new phenomenon. This is an old phenomenon. And it means that a very, very, very small slice of Americans is actually choosing our Congress and choosing state legislators and choosing school board members and making real decisions that impact our lives every day. And that's only going to get worse if we think about 2018. So if we look at that drop-off in 2014 among the two immigrant origin communities, of course, not all Latinos are immigrant, nor are all Asian Americans, but they are the most foreign-born groups in our society, you can see that that's a pretty dramatic drop, and also it's only going to get worse. So part of the reason why turnout was so abysmal in 2014 was not just that you did have that drop in turnout among Latinos and Asians, but also that they made up a larger proportion of the electorate. And that will only be more true in 2018. So we need to think about what it is about the way that we run campaigns that makes people not feel like they matter. Even though these midterm campaigns in California, we're going to be picking our governor, right? Think about what our electorate, think about what that looks like for our electorate in California. And so to appreciate, we need a fundamental change. So the question Taeku had posed to us was, what has to change? And I think we need a fundamental change in how we run campaigns. And we also need a fundamental change then in how the Democratic Party chooses to invest in campaigns. So yes, we do. Because we spend billions of dollars every cycle, and we don't spend it actually talking to people and doing the kind of organizing that needs to happen in order to actually make that slide look different in the next iteration. And so what does this mean? It's a fundamental change in terms of what donors choose to give money for. And this is where the technology fetish comes up. I've done some work with the Democracy Alliance and did some research for them and was told when we were writing our report we needed something new and shiny. You always need something new and shiny. Doesn't matter if it's any good. It just has to seem new and shiny. And the way that you change that slide is through long-term investment where you may not win immediately. You may not win for the first 6 cycles, right? We need to invest in Texas. Massive state, but do it intelligently, right? So where we put our money, to put it toward mobilizing people instead of ad buys, which is how we do it now, right? Believing that the goal is inclusion rather than persuasion, and the obsession with persuasion has to change. It also means we have to change how we recruit candidates. I was in a meeting with the Arizona Table in February, and they were talking about how their Democratic Party, so you have all this energy, all these organizations that are doing all this great work, they're trying to pull people out, they've got people who want to run for office, and the party won't support their candidates because they say that they won't win, right? They're not conservative enough. They want moderate Democrats because they think that's what's going to win in Arizona. Instead of saying, no, actually you need a progressive Democrat so you can turn out all the people who haven't turned out up till now and actually win on the Democratic side. But again, that's not how we do things. And so it's not by accident that that slide looks the way that it does. And so to appreciate that we need we have to get rid of the voter suppression laws, we have to do a number of other legal things, but just appreciating the fundamental way we imagine where it is we should put our money, how we should invest it, and to whom we need to be speaking, because that's a big part of the problem. Who is our base? It's not, if there's one thing you come out of this panel with, please know that Trump supporters were middle income, racially resentful, non-college educated whites. They were not working class. It's not that simple.
Exactly. Thank you.
And if you look at the Democracy in Color website, they have a plan for how to win back the House without turning any of those Trump voters. What we have to do is invest in progressive whites and communities of color. And that's not what the Dems have done. And what concerns me is that the conversation coming out of November 16 has been very much, oh, we need to get there was just a, Guy Cecil, right, just came out with the research on the Obama-Trump voter. Those are not the people. If all those folks in Philly, if all my folks in Philly, we actually have Latinos in Philly too, had they turned any of them out, Latinos in Michigan could have been the difference, right? And we gave them those numbers in January of 16, the party didn't do anything with them. So I think just appreciating where the low-hanging fruit are and who they are is not how we've thought about it before.
So, yeah, I think it's a false dichotomy.
Told you.
Yeah, no. I think the question is how to turn a moment into a movement, and not to choose between them, but how to make the connection between them. And what I mean is that, in a way, the Trump victory also exposed the bankruptcy of so much of what has been Democratic politics up to this point, in terms of having a program that actually addresses the needs of most of the American people. It's just like not there, and hasn't been there ever since sort of Bill Clinton embraced Reagan's view of government. This whole systematic running down of government, the private sector is going to save everything, marketize everything, and the Democrats have bought it as much as Republicans. And that's a real problem.
It is.
Because then the policy that's needed to actually address the needs of working Americans, whether they are black or white or Latino or whatever, they're not embraced. They just aren't embraced. They run away from them. I have to say I was really disappointed that President Obama took up that $400,000 fee.
Oh, see, I wasn't.
Boy, I just thought that, to me, that's like, what are our politics about? And if we don't have leadership that has integrity and courage in the way in which it operates, I don't know. I don't know what we have, particularly when it comes to leadership, but I digress. What I'm saying is that historically, American politics have been a dance between movements and parties. And Dan Schlossman has a recent book on this that I think is terrific. It shows how it's an interaction, particularly because our electoral system is so sclerotic and so skewed, that social movements have been the energy or the dynamism that has often been the source of transformation and change, both of the left and of the right. Now, I guess the question I have, could this be a movement moment? I have to say, we did a little thing, the students at the Kennedy School did a thing called Resistance School and went online offering instruction, hour-and-a-half session on tools to organize now. They thought maybe 100 people show up. 100 people showed up in person, 40,000 showed up online. Indivisible has like 7,000 groups, at least 2 in every congressional district, because they scaffolded group action focused on a local target, part of a national effort. Not the aggregating of individual, people just, clicking their mice or whatever, but actual group action at the local level coupled into a national effort and targeted in a way that they would get a response. Very, very smart. Women's March now is trying to have huddles all over the place. There is this appetite for learning right now on how do we get the tools to translate this reaction, this abomination that Trump is, into, I have trouble with the word resistance because this isn't about going back to the status quo. This is about going forward. And I think that if we don't blow it, we have an opportunity to reground progressive politics in this country at a much broader level. It means we have to overcome our struggles, our internal struggles. It means we have to go places we've been afraid to go because of donors and so forth. But this is an opportunity. And Tom Hayden used to say, change is slow except when it's fast. And we're in a fast moment right now, folks. We really are. And the choices people make in this moment are really going to matter. And going to what Lisa was saying, if we stay into this whole mobilizing approach, and by mobilizing, I mean aggregating just individuals, and we let go of the need to organize, which is creating collective capacity, building real capacity at the community level, then I think we miss the chance. And finally, I think we have to take the fight to them. I mean, it is unconscionable that there should be in red districts and states no Democratic candidate running for anything. Yep. I mean, then it just condemns those folks to their own little echo chambers, right? And so that's just, Howard Dean had a 50-state strategy. That was a good thing. But if we don't contest the turf, see, progressives tend to want to mobilize the people that already agree with them. Yep. I don't think that's enough to win.
No, it's not.
When you're organizing a union, you can't just mobilize the people that agree with you. You got to organize the people that are there. And I think we have to engage. And I think we can engage, and I think we can win if we'll engage, but not if we back away from it. So that's what I think we should do.
Well, I hope people heard agreement there, because we actually agreed in about half of the stuff that you said. So, I'm hoping that people heard agreement there.
Half is a good place to start. So let me see if I can break that down a little bit into less than half. We've got just a few more minutes before I really want to open up this conversation. So if I can get your quick thoughts on this, which is another part of this post-November conversation that I think we're all collectively having. I think one kind of narrative that has emerged, bouncing around, and to me it feels like it's getting louder, is that part of the problem with the progressive left in the US today is that it's too fragmented.
Yes.
And it's too siloed into groups that are organizing around interests and identities.
Yeah.
And even with this panel, I can look at each of you and pigeonhole you into particular interests and identities. Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ rights, unionism, environmental rights, immigrants and Latinos, and so on. And so the question is, from your standpoint, is this a time to continue that work because it's as relevant as ever? Because the Trump administration's assaults are in terms of interests and in terms of identities? Or is this a time when you really have to step back and think from the standpoint of your investments in politics that are organized around interests and identities, on those very terms, is this a time to move away from organizing your work around interests and identities?
Really quick, we have to organize. We have to organize around whatever the concept is, whether it's an interest or an identity or institutions that get you out to care about politics and the people around you. I don't really care what it is, to be honest, in terms of what motivates you to participate in the system, but something needs to be it. And so I think it is identity politics for some people that motivates them. In fact, my last book, Little Rock Crisis, is all about the Little Rock Nine and how Little Rock 9 and 57 still motivates people today in Little Rock to participate in American political process because they see that as the catalyst moment and why they care about politics today, because it was local and state issue that introduced them to that, and social movement work. And that can be identity stuff for them. That's local, that's state-based, that's also based on your ascriptive characteristics. But it need not be that solely. What we also have to do is we actually have to listen to each other, like we're doing in this panel, like we've done throughout this conference, and that's not actually happening in a lot of the progressive community. That's a real concern that I have. People who disagree on the left are not talking to each other. They're in their own enclaves, and many of them made errors. We participated on an individual basis. We were convinced to vote for our individual interests, things that we cared about for ourselves and how we might see ourselves vis-a-vis the state or the system. And we need to remember going forward for midterms and for local and state elections, for any other elections, one, you have to participate. This is the first election since '68 where the Voting Rights Act was not at its full capacity of protection. And we screwed that up even worse. So we knew the black vote, for example, Latino vote and others would be decreased from 2012 because we did not have minority candidate at the top of the ticket. But it did not have to be as low as it was, and particularly in urban areas. And I think a lot of that did have to do with misinformation from progressive communities about what Clinton did or what she didn't do or what have you. A lot of that stuff was fake news. A lot of progressives were part of the Russian hacking scandal, did get duped by misinformation on Facebook and Twitter and what have you, shared that stuff, and that stuff turned out to be not factual. But the point is, you actually have to vote. And so we have to get rid of the idea that we can't participate and actually create change. And then secondly, we have to vote our group interest. In political science, what we, of course, have called over the years linked fate. We have to vote our group interest still, not what is best for me and my individual condition, but what's best for me and the people who are part of the groups that I ascribe myself to. And if I vote what's best for, in my case, the black community, the LGBTQ community, et cetera, even if it's against my own individual preferences, that's what I should be doing, and that's what the rest of us should be doing too.
I think it's, I'm sorry, no, you can applaud. Just briefly, I think it's a matter of going deep. In the Obama campaign in 2007-8, one of the sort of joys of that campaign was people were freed from their issue silos. Mm-hmm. There was a clear set of values that actually anchored the transformation of diversity from obstacle to asset. And I think that's where the politics is. It's not about denying identity politics. It's incorporating in a deeper commitment. Look, equality of gender, equality of race, equality of economic equality. I mean, these are inseparable. And maybe now we call it intersectionality. Mm-hmm. But they've always been inseparable. You can't get one without getting them all. And so for me, it's a question of going deep and not negating, but bringing into a much broader vision of what progressive politics is about and how it can really make a real difference in people's lives. That's where I think we have the opportunity right now.
So,
if I can just quickly,
Yeah,
because there is one thing, I really hate the whole term identity politics because I think it negates and obviates and trivializes a deep shared lived experience. And so if Latinos choose to organize together on a set of issues, it's because they have a shared history and a shared structural position in American society that leads them to a shared set of interests that isn't just because of how they identify, but actually because of, in fact, what they've been challenged with in their lives and how that's laid out in America by racial lines or sexuality or gender or whatnot. So I really want to say we should not use that term. I think the right, we've adopted the language of the right in that context. But I think we have great examples in California about how you can do both things. You can have specific organizations working in their communities on things that matter to them, grounded. But then what happened after the LA uprising is that people sat down and built coalition and had those difficult conversations. And exactly what we talked about, brought them together. And so you have coalitions like California Calls, where you have 16, I believe now, community organizations across the state who do their work in their community, grounded in their community, but choose to come together, have a steering committee that decides on a set of shared values and a set of things that they're going to prioritize, but they're still going to work on their work on the ground, because coalitions don't always agree on every single thing, but you have to work together and appreciate that that requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of conversation. It requires sometimes giving up your thing that you really want to do this time for the greater good, and that funders need to appreciate the time and space necessary for that kind of coalition making to happen. And I think that's what's not happening enough in other parts of the state, but I think here one thing we have are some really good examples of groups doing that work and doing it well and having real impact on policy and politics.
Great. So let's open this up. We got about 10 or 15 minutes for any questions from you all. So I think are there mics somewhere?
Yeah, there are mic runners on either side of the room. And if you have a question, could you just take a moment to be sure that your question is clear and succinct? And the mic runners will spot you. We have time for maybe 3 or 4 questions. Please stand up and say your name.
Maybe we covered the whole thing.
Yeah, maybe.
Over here.
Hello? Can you guys hear me?
You can't see
I
me.
can't see it because with a question anyway.
Yes,
Over
right over here,
here,
to your
left.
left, panelist.
Yeah. I'm Tyler Barberin, a University of Richmond alum, so I won't let VCU
Woo,
rivalry
woo,
cloud
represent.
my judgment. But I just want to push back on some of the things that you've spoken about regarding, I guess, progressive, particularly millennial voters. So I do agree that there is a way to do both and to reform the system in a way that helps people immediately, but not participate in dangerous and toxic components of our life. And so, first and foremost, 93% of black women came out to vote for Hillary Clinton.
Yes, they did.
I want to put that out there. So when you speak about black people or black progressives not coming out to support, I just want to be clear that we're not talking about all black people.
That's very true.
And then beyond that, I am a firm believer that people who say Hillary would be better for people don't view those in the global South as people, because she has a history of not being for people in other countries or being very willing to expand American imperialism. She came out before Trump bombed Syria and said, bomb Syria. So I just want to be clear that the lesser of two evil argument that a lot of progressives were wrestling with is not an invalid one. It's not that we were wholly wrong. And then beyond that, progressives were also extremely involved in grassroots movements and organizing on the ground and helping people. I voted for Beyonce because I live in DC and I knew Hillary's gonna win, but I also voted for the lower ranking officials, so working on the ground, the people who are really gonna affect our lives. Not saying that Trump isn't screwing stuff up for a lot of people, and I know I'm rambling, but I just wanna get your perspective on like the nuance, and also how we're speaking about not isolating, not othering, but yet you blanketly say progressives or black progressives are doing X, Y, and Z. And me sitting in the audience, that just felt like an othering comment.
Thank you.
Can you tell me your name again?
Did you
I'm
say
sorry, I forgot your
did
name.
you say your name again?
Oh, Tyler.
Tyler?
Yeah.
Hi, Tyler. So I really appreciate your question. This is the problem of being on a panel where you have short time. If I had to go, if you could read some of my articles or books on this stuff, I would love for you to do so. I can share it with you also for free after, where I get into the nuance that you're talking about. You're right. It's completely inexcusable to frame everyone in a particular category like black progressives, because there is nuance there. And in, for example, op-ed that I have coming out in a couple days, it explains that out clearly, but it's difficult to do when you have 30 seconds to talk. But I will say that you're absolutely right. So black women came out and voted in significantly high numbers. The issue largely was in terms of the black left of center communities was really large with millennial voters and with men. And what we find was that in several instances, while women were able to find it not robbery to vote for Hillary Clinton, the other groups were not. I do think the lesser two evils argument actually is not a legitimate one. And to me, all we have to do is look at every single disaster from November 8th to the present from the mouth or the pen of President Donald J. Trump Jr. All of those disasters are absolutely things that would not have happened had Hillary Clinton been in that office. And to claim that that is somehow that would have occurred under a Clinton presidency is just inaccurate. Yes, in terms of the globally oppressed people, this is an American capitalist warmonger country. This is what we are. That's not going to change in the next 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, 20 years. Even though I agree that it should, it could, and I hope that it will. But today, in the next 2 years and midterms, 4 years for presidents and local and state elections, the system is what it is now. And so if we are concerned, if we claim to be concerned about people's lives today, not our children and grandchildren, not just them, because we are concerned about them, but not only them, but we're concerned about people living today and tomorrow and next week and next month, then we have to be dealing with, in my opinion, the institutions and the people running to try to run those institutions today, even if there are issues about them that they don't like. I voted in Virginia primary. It was very difficult for me to vote for Hillary Clinton. Let me be very clear about that. It was hard. It's one of the hardest votes I've ever done, because I actually agreed with most of what Bernie said. But my problem was that being an actual political scientist, I knew that most of what Bernie said was never going to happen, even if he won. And so I had to choose to be a little bit more pragmatic, and that was the choice that I made, despite the fact that that was difficult for me personally. I still think I made the better decision for black Virginians, for gay Virginians, and queer Virginians, for example, in voting in the primary for Hillary Clinton, even if that was against my own individual preferences at the time. Because for me, it was more important to ensure that the communities that I claim to care about, that those people were actually in the best position to achieve measurable progress in the short term. The obvious example to that was Hillary Clinton last time. And if we participate in any way, so for example, you said you voted in DC, you voted for Beyonce. Beyonce actually did something really cool, and that's actually something really cool that Donald Trump actually did. Donald Trump actually opened up the doors to people like Beyonce and Oprah's and other folks to legitimately consider running for office. So I actually think that's a good thing, because billionaires and millionaires have found out that essentially if you can pay your way through Super Tuesday, then you have a good chance of becoming president, even if you have no experience. So that's actually a good thing. The difficulty, and this is I'm going to wrap up. The difficulty with that for me is that for DC, yes, you might have done the right thing and voted for local and state elections. I applaud you for that, but you voted for Beyonce because you knew the district would go blue. The question I would have is that for other people like you, though, did they do that and also use their social media and the millions or thousands of contacts that they have to ensure that each of their followers is doing the same thing? Or did they instead use their rhetoric and their influence to encourage people generally to not vote or to not participate because of the ideas about theory over our actual group interests? And I suspect that most people did not actually do what you did, and that they actually carried the message forward that was anti-Clinton that led to, in many ways, the nail in her coffin on November 8th.
Don't get Dr. Perry going, because he
Sorry.
will teach.
Maybe we can get
We
a
have
few
time
questions.
for one more question with one more answer.
Hi.
My bad,
name is
sorry.
Crystal.
Hi.
Crystal Haling. I'm way back here in the back. Thank you guys so much for this panel and for this conference. We've talked about othering, which is the fear. And we've talked about belonging, which is the love. And I'm wondering if each of you, in 3 words, can describe the values that we need to have moving forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, start us off.
Well, othering and belonging are 3 words.
No.
Okay, that was a pun.
That was a pun.
That was such a pun. What comes
You
to
each
mind
get
is,
3 words
is
each,
cariño,
but the value.
honradez, y trabajo, which is something I heard from one of my respondents for my first book, and I think that's what we need. Work, love and care, cariño is sort of a combination of both, and honor and integrity. I think that's what we need.
Yeah. Compassion, equality, and dignity.
First word for me is justice. And the second word would be equity. And the third word would be power.
Thank you.
I guess for me would be building unstoppable force, because what faces us looks like an immovable object, and then we'll let physics work it out.
Thank you. Taeku, we thought you might want to close out for us.
Well, I wouldn't mind just taking one more question, just
Yeah.
because there are a number of people who had their hands up, so maybe we can do that.
I have a question. I'm way in the back.
Oh.
I'm concerned that part of the voter suppression will come from voters of color being traumatized by seeing the Ku Klux Klan, the National Fraternal Order of Police, the National Rifle Association, all these armed entities who also endorsed Trump, and that's going to create trauma, and people will be less likely to turn out to vote. So how can we embolden voters even when there's a lot of violence and exposure to these very scary images?
Well, I mean, I think that's why you need to organize, so people don't feel like they're voting as individuals, but they feel like they're part of a collective. They know there are people who have their back. They can go to the polls with other people. I mean, I think this is why you can't have 1 2-minute conversation at the door and think that that's going to change people's actions. You need to actually have them engaged and a sense of a collective that is moving forward and is powerful and is with you. And if you do that, people become unstoppable.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree too.
Well, on that note of agreement, I would like to, before things, I would just like to thank you all as an audience. It's been an incredibly rich panel. I think there's a lot to think about. There's a lot of connective tissue to the earlier parts of this conference and hopefully the parts that will come tomorrow. So please give a warm round of applause to our panelists.